Welcome to A Blueprint for Equity, a show about constructing a more inclusive community in the architecture, engineering, and construction industries. I'm your host, Candice Harrison, Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at SSOE Group. Each episode will explore the challenges and opportunities facing the AEC industry as we strive to create a more equitable and inclusive environment from job sites to conference rooms. Our guests will share their perspectives on key issues and help us understand how we can advance DEI practices in and around our industry. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second episode of A Blueprint for Equity. For those of you who took the opportunity to listen to our first episode, which focused on diversity in higher education, thank you. It was an important conversation, and I'm honored to have been a part of it with our three lovely guests. Today, I have the exciting opportunity to speak to Melvin Gravely, the CEO of Triversity Construction. He's also the author of the book called Dear White Friend. He's an active civic leader in his community, which is the Cincinnati area. He also is an amazing person to have a conversation with, and I'm sure you're going to be excited just as we are to have him. So Mel, welcome to A Blueprint for Equity.
Hey, Candice, good to be with you.
I want to tell you a little bit more about him. As I mentioned before, he's the CEO of Triversity Construction, a commercial construction company headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio. This firm has diversity built right into its brand. And if you don't believe me, please feel free to check out his leadership page on their website. But most importantly, he's the husband to Chandra, father to 3 children, and what I'm guessing is one of his favorite roles is being grandpa to his granddaughter, Ava.
You got that right.
So let's talk about why you wrote the book.
Yeah. So you got to think about the time, right? So it's 2019 heading into 2020. And so in the fall of that year, I took a racial equity class. So that started me thinking more deeply about race and about its implications on our nation and the history of race and the way we built our country. And what bothered me most about that training is I walked out and I was upset about what I didn't know. I'm a writer. I like to write. I express myself through writing. And so I began to seek out ways to express what I was trying to figure out. But what really hit me was if I didn't know these things about race, if I, growing up in America as an African-American man in the Midwest, did not know these things about race, how could I expect my white friends to know? Where would they have learned it? So I began to ask that question, where would they have learned it? And I have so many tremendous relationships with people who happen to be white. I began to want to express to them what this message meant to me. So if you fast forward a little while longer to the spring, I've been writing these letters. So spring of 20 now. So COVID is fully enraged. We're all concerned about that. But it did create some time on my agenda because I wasn't going to any events. We're just working and trying to figure it all out. And if you remember, it's around that time when Ahmaud Arbery's assault and murder happened. And that was the time I recognized that as I was listening in the world, there was not a business person speaking to this issue in a way that brought us together. So I went down this mission to write to my white friends about this issue in a candid but direct way. So my assumption, Candice, is if they knew better, they might do better. And I made that assumption that I could help them with an on-ramp, and that's what this book is all about.
And I think you did an amazing job at doing just that. Before we get into a little bit more about the book and just some of your perspectives, I want to move to now. What do you think, or I should say, what is your opinion with what's going on with race in our country today?
Yeah, we really can't continue without pausing to acknowledge the context that we're sitting in today. So here's my real take. First, I try to stay focused on what I can do and not get too distracted by the noise of culture wars and things of that nature. But if you just look at who's doing the talking and why, it is primarily politicians on the left and the right who are trying to inflame us in the middle for their own interests. And the way to get votes and support today is to create fear and to divide us. And so they're using those tools because we are allowing them to use those tools to incite us to believe a particular way. And so what I would say about today is that in order to hold our democracy together, we can no longer be intellectually lazy, lack curiosity, and jump and rush to judgment. If we do at our own peril. We'll divide ourselves even more. But I'm also finding that no matter how far right or how far left you are on the continuum, when we talk at the micro interpersonal level, there's a lot of agreement. There's a lot of appreciation for a person's journey and their story. And so I've stopped trying to fix politics because that's really what we're seeing out there is politicians doing politics. And I've tried to focus on the community I know the best, which is the business community, and having more candid conversations about the realities we face and expecting my friends to take steps toward bringing us together, closing the gap between races.
And one of the things that you did say is that we can't trust what we've learned about race. And I think some of what you just said probably is part of that position. But why can't we?
Well, we can't trust what we learned about race because we didn't learn much about race. We learned that people were enslaved. Actually, that's not what we learned. We learned about slavery, which, if you just change that context to say people were enslaved, it brings a heightened sensitivity to it. But we learned about slavery, which made it almost a thing that happened, but not to people. We learned that slavery was bad, and we learned that white America saved Black America from slavery. We learned that we had a civil rights movement, and we learned that we're all equal. There's a lot of stuff that happened in between, like an industrial revolution, like the building of highways, like the creation of wealth, like the accumulation of land, like the startup of businesses. There's a lot of stuff that happened in that period that created a systemic fracture in the races. And it was all done, most of it was done legally and by policy that our nation intentionally imposed. And so the reason we can't trust what we learned about race is because we didn't learn about it. We learned about milestone markers that whitewashed, if I could use that term, a complete history. And the implications of all of that are not discussed in what we learned. It's not discussed in what white people learn. It's not discussed in what you and I learned in school either. And so I'm not vilifying the schools. I'm simply saying we kind of learned about race like we learned about sex. You know, you had the highlights in school, but you really learned it from your friends who told you about things that, quite honestly, that's a terrible way to learn about sex, and it's a terrible way to learn about race. But that's why we can't trust it. We've got to be more intellectually curious. We have to ask more questions. We have to study on our own.
I know you talked about systemic as it relates to race. And I heard you speak before, and you gave a wonderful analogy of that. It was phenomenal. At least for me, I understood it in full. But what I like the most about it is, to me, it helps people who may not have understand it better, which was your analogy using Monopoly.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I used the Monopoly game to explain, and it's really well documented in the book. But I used the game of Monopoly to explain the difference between equity, which has become a bad word, and equality, which most of my friends all believe in. And I start by the premise of it's too late to just talk about equality. Let me tell you why. And the Monopoly game is an interesting example. A professor divided her 9 students into 3 groups. And we all know the Monopoly game. It is the great equality game. I mean, everyone gets the same amount of money. Everyone gets a turn. Everyone gets to roll the dice. And it's a little bit of chance to it because there's dice involved. It's a little bit of daring and skill because you've got to decide whether to buy or not to buy. But everyone gets started at the same time with the same amount of money. They get $200 when they pass go. It's like a great equality game. But she decided to make it a bit less equal. She let the first 3 of the 9 students start right away. And they went around the board a number of times. You know what they did? They bought property. They then put houses on it. They accumulated money. They got $200 every time they passed go. 45 minutes later, she let the second group start. And that group started the game. And there was no doubt the group in front of them was in front of them. But there was still some opportunity on the board for them to buy property and maybe in the future put a house on it and maybe even a hotel one day. But then she let the third group start. Now, think about this. An hour and a half after starting the Monopoly game, and those of you who play Monopoly will understand this, that board is pretty full.
Mm-hmm.
The property's been purchased. There's houses on it. There's hotels on it. And if you remember the Monopoly game, when you land on someone else's property as you move yourself around the board, you have to pay them rent. And so the third group joined, and there were no opportunities to buy. There were no opportunities to put homes on things. Their opportunity was to move around the board and pay rent. They hadn't done anything wrong. I could argue that the game for them was equal because they started with the same amount of money. They got $200 every time they pass go. They got a turn to roll the dice. But the fact that they started an hour and a half after, and everyone else had been industriously building their wealth that whole time, the gap that got created between group 1 and group 3 is almost impossible to close without some intentionality. So when you start talking about equality, I'm all for it. I wish we could, but we all then have to put all our chips in the middle of the board. We have to give up all our property, to give all of our businesses, and we got to start over. And that's not going to happen. So how do we fix it? We've got to look of actions of intentionality, focus on closing that gap. Some people would call it acts of equity, but I realize equity is a bad word with a lot of folks. But that systemic fracture permeates our world today, or at least our country. And it shows up in healthcare. It shows up in home ownership rates. It shows up in education level. It shows up in education success. It shows up in wealth creation and income levels and business formation and size of businesses. And in our industry, I mean, I'm competing, and my company was founded in 2005. I'm competing with companies that have been around for 7 generations. Of course, they've done it more often than I have. Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean I can't do it. We've done it 3 times. They've done it 300 times, right? I'm just using an extreme example. So, when I hear people say, I believe in equality, I say, I do too. But, but we're not starting from a place where equality makes any sense anymore.
Right. And you actually kind of did a good segue into what I was going to ask next is how does that play out in the workplace where, as companies are trying to, say, hey, we have diversity as a priority, but when we have this history in play, how does that play out in the workplace?
Yeah. Well, like I just described, right? So there's these gaps in size, capacity, length in business, even the wherewithal to put good systems in place inside of a business. And so the gaps that you see in our marketplace for subcontractors, our marketplace for partners that we might use, there's this huge gap. And there are things we can do about that, but they all involve us meeting people where they are and working with them in ways that are more strategic than they are transactional. And quite honestly, our industry is significantly guilty of being transactional instead of strategic. But to fix this, I think you've got to have strategic things that you do. And even in our workforce, I can trace virtually every gap that we see in academic performance, who's coming out of which schools. I can trace it all back to the fractures that we created through the intentional laws and policies of our nation as we built it. And when you look at something as pervasive as how we fund public schools to this day, is something that just tilts the scale against folks being successful coming out of those schools. It shows up in many, many ways, Candice. And I'm just trying to get people to at least acknowledge first. You can't decide whether you want to fix anything if you don't acknowledge that, we did this intentionally and it's in front of us now. And the question is, do we want to do anything about it?
Hey, listeners, we have a special treat for you today. If you have been enjoying Mel and I's conversation about his book, Dear White Friend, we have a treat for you. You have an opportunity to receive your own copy, but here's what you have to do. Take a moment to leave us a review on your favorite podcast player, Spotify, Apple, or whatever you use. And we want you to be honest. Once done, snap a screenshot of your review and email it to us at marketing@ssoe.com. Your screenshot is your ticket to enter this amazing giveaway. Not only do you get a chance to win a great book, but your feedback helps us to keep bringing you content that you love. So hit pause, drop that review, and don't forget to send us a screenshot. This was when I first was introduced to you when we were looking at a speaker for one of our corporate sessions, the book, Dear White Friend. And on the cover, it said, "My friend, I do not believe that you are a racist." And that has still been one of my favorite perspectives of your book, is that you are writing this to someone who you see as a friend. Yeah. You're not writing this to be antagonizing, not to be divisive. It's truly having an open and honest dialogue, which people always say, let's have an open conversation. But as soon as it gets uncomfortable, then they don't want to have it. Right. And I think that you masterfully did this because you are very honest in your perspectives. You're also very honest about your own perspectives. But one of the things you discussed was judgment. So I do want to know, did you have any pushback from your friends who are Black or other minority groups on approaching the book in this way?
Absolutely. I decided this book was just right when I was getting enough heat from both sides. I thought I probably got it figured out now. Yeah, I had Black friends call me up and say, hey, I read the early copies because a lot of people read this book before it came out. I wanted a lot of input about it. I read the early copies. I love what you've done here. I've got a few, concerns. And one of them The most pervasive was this idea that white people, my white friends, as I described, were not racist. I'm not talking to racist people. Like that's not who I'm writing to. They're also not my friends. I didn't name this book Dear White Friends because I wasn't talking about my friends. I'm talking about my friends, and they include now people whoever's open to reading this book, I now consider one of my friends, whether they're white, black, or whatever, because they're at least open to the conversation. We get hate mail all the time. It upsets my team, but they didn't read the book. So I'm not talking to them. I'm actually talking to my friends. But my black friends call me accommodating. They question, how is it possible that my white friends are not racist? And I simply say this, that number one, I couldn't be friends with someone I thought was racist. The term is that problematic for me. Number two, I define racist as someone who is intentionally and knowingly waking up, at least often, trying to do harm to someone else, typically a person of color. That's a racist to me. Those aren't my white friends. I do believe that some of my white friends are benefiting bystanders, and I call that out in the book, where they see things being done and they don't speak out about it. But I don't think that makes you a racist. It probably makes you a person who is watching this happen and not doing anything about it. So I would call you a benefiting bystander. So that's important to me. And the reason it's on the cover, it was probably in, letter number 6 or something. And I had one white friend call me up and he says, I was reading your book and I was waiting for you to call me a racist. And then I read the letter where you say, hey, friend, I don't consider you a racist. And he said, if you're going to tell me that, could you tell me that earlier so I'm not sitting on pins and needles? So I just put it on the cover because I thought if that's going to block someone from reading it or invite them to read it, then I need to put it up front. Candice, we don't make any progress if no one hears the thoughts of other people. And so the last reason I make this statement that my white friends are not racist is it's a practical one. If I call you a racist, the conversation is over. You're not listening to me anymore because you're now defending yourself against being a racist. And since I don't think you are one anyway, why would I let that go without being said up front?
I love that perspective. It's a great perspective and it's a great way to remove barriers, but also disarm a person because you want the message. You want them to receive the message. And there are some powerful messages in the book. And I want people to get the book. So I don't want to share all of them here, but there were so many nuggets. I keep bringing them up. In the same spirit of that, one of the things you talked about in the book is not being quick to judge. And I told you before that this actually resonated with me because I have also been in your shoes of being in a situation where I maybe didn't understand. I had no knowledge of the background of a group of people, and I just made wild assumptions and then had to check my own self about the direction that my mind was going without knowing people. And so I think what I loved the most about it was true, it was honest, it was some self-reflection and some self-realization, but also it is something that people do at work and they do it often. People you work with, you'll even hear conversations of, well, they should have, or why didn't they? I hear it most when we talk about people being pulled over and, just how people should act when they're pulled over and things like that. But aside from that, thinking about how people judge and that conversation in the book, what can we do in the workplace to prevent that? Or how does empathy help us?
Yeah, I think we got to just begin to nudge our friends a bit. There are 2 trigger words for me, and all my friends know it, and my kids know it too. Using the word should or ought are judgmental words. That is me saying to you, based on my own set of values, circumstances, situations, and background, that you should be doing something. And quite honestly, I don't know enough about you, Candice. Like, I know you, but I don't know enough about your situation, your headspace, I just don't know enough. And so for me to use should and ought, I can't remember the last time I let them stay in a sentence. Sometimes they come out of my mouth and I stop the sentence and go back because I don't want to use should and ought. And so it's just a practical thing. As you hear people say should and ought, I think we got to nudge our friends and say, well, that's your value set. That's your priority. That's your history. And I'll give you a perfect example. I used to really have trouble with tattoos above the chest. I just got to be honest. I just had trouble. I always thought, why the heck would you put a tattoo on your neck? Like, why would you do that? And we had a young person working for us. He also had dreads. and he had an earring, and he had a tattoo on his neck. And he was also just a bad, bad dude. Like, he really knew what he was doing. And what I learned from watching him was that stuff don't really matter if you know what you're doing. That can't be a part of how I measure his value and how I direct his career. I like that choice. No, I didn't. Did I think it looked great? I did not. But I don't know what that young man's story is and what his situation is and where he came from and how dare I tell him how to express myself. So part of this is this understanding that it ain't my business like that. What is my business is how he performs. And he could deliver for customers. But I've had to work on it. I mean, I'll be honest with you. This idea of empathy, not sympathy, is a difficult notion for people because they cross the line. Empathy says, I'm seeking to understand why what's in front of me is how it's presenting. I'm really seeking to understand, why do you talk this way to me or talk this way? Why are you approaching the work this way? Why are you dressed this way? I'm trying to understand, not so I can judge, but so I can connect. But there's a line that crosses that goes from empathy to excusing behavior that is inappropriate, to performance that does not work. Now I got sympathy for someone. Now I'm not going that far. Empathy to me is very simple. I want to seek to understand why your views are the way they are. Really understand, not so I can correct them, not so I can change your mind, but I can become enlightened by understanding how you got here, because that drives a cultural competence that in our workplace, in our communities, are going to allow us to prosper together, to work together in new ways. Because at the end of the day, what a person wears, their dialect, whether they have the right noun, verb, consistency is less relevant to what we can accomplish together. And we can't accomplish those things if we don't have the empathy to seek to understand.
Yes, and also understanding, as you have said, that people and their upbringing is different. And a lot of times when we do that, it's an assumption that they have been cultured like we have, and their norms are like our norms. So we feel like their norms are wrong, or their norms are not appropriate because they're not the same norms as ours.
Yeah, and Candice, I appreciate you bringing that up. I tell a story in the book about trying to understand what multi-generational poverty looks like and what a mindset that has been raised in multiple generations of poverty, how they have to think, how they have to behave, what the horizon of decision making is. They're worried about the next hour, oftentimes, not the next decade. Because to survive in certain situations, you have to be much more short-term oriented. You have to be willing to respond very quickly to something. And so it may, you said, we've been cultured differently. It may show up looking weird to you and I, but it's actually how they've had to survive and where they've been. And I'm not judging them. Now I can say, I get it. Let me help you understand how that has to look in our workplace. But now I at least have a level of understanding of, okay, I see why, because I've asked enough questions and I've sought to understand, and I'm talking and I'm in relationship with someone, and that takes time. But the time that we spend in empathy is time well spent.
Absolutely. Let's talk about Triversity.
Okay.
What kinds of things have you done specifically in your company to put equity into practice? I'm sure you've done lots of things, like I talked about very early in the podcast, that you can go and look at the leadership and see that you are practicing what you preach. So what kinds of things have you done to get there?
Yeah. So we have the benefit of being young and intentional from the start. So I don't have to go back and fix a culture. I'm building one as we go. But let me just talk about some of the practical things we have done and we do every day. Let's take hiring, for example. We see a diverse workforce as imperative to our success. That is very different than most companies. So some companies, they think it'd be nice to have. Other companies think it's important. We can't be who we are. We literally cannot fulfill our purpose without a diverse workforce. So our activities in recruiting, retaining, and developing are built because we have to win. So the places we'll go to recruit, the way we'll look at job descriptions, to alter them even, to broaden the pool of candidates we might get, the onboarding and training we'll provide, the co-op experiences that we have. We recently started taking high school students now We can't put them in the field, but we've got them under our roof. And we're going to train them to be accountants or IT professionals, HR professionals, construction, whatever it takes. But we're going to expose them to what work looks like because we've got to, it's imperative for us. So I would first say to you that we've made it imperative. That would be number one. Also, I am asking questions as the CEO. So before every hire, I get a letter from HR department and it's copying the hiring manager. It presents the candidate for approval. I don't know the candidate from Adam. I don't even know the job description, but I'm going to ask the same questions. What did the pool look like? How diverse was the pool? The hiring manager can hire whoever they want, but how diverse was the pool is my first question. If it's not diverse, we got a problem. The second thing is who interviewed them. In our business, we have a diversity of who interviews folks because we all have biases that we just don't know about. And so there's always a woman in every interview. There's always a person of color in every interview. And the majority of our team is white. So we have white males and females in the interview process. But that diverse team is important for the candidate to see, but also for us to make sure that we didn't miss any blind spots around their cultural capabilities to be in our organization. So those are just a couple of practical things that we do. And, but if it starts at our board level, our board is very diverse, people of color and women in our board. Our C-suite is too. Our co-op pool is increasingly more diverse. So for some reason, women in construction have found Triversity to be a place they want to work because they see we promote women in construction at Triversity. They see women in construction in increasing leadership roles, handling some of our largest accounts and largest projects. And so when they co-op with us, they want to come back. So we built that culture intentionally, Candice. And it's not easy because we're fishing in the same pool everyone else is. Mm-hmm. But again, it starts with the fact that this is imperative for our success.
Mel, what do you say to people who say, it shouldn't matter about race. I just want the best candidate. I just want the best person on my team.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot.
I hear it a lot too. And I love that. I love when they say it because they've opened a door for me to say what I'm about to say to you. If you don't broaden who comes in the door, how can you possibly tell me you got the best? How can you possibly say to me that your team is all white males and you possibly have the best? So the best means what? The best means technical skills. The best means ability to connect with their coworkers. The best means ability to work with customers. The best. What does the best mean? If I create a holistic view of what the best is going to be diverse. Because that's going to be the best ideas. That's going to be the best presentation to my customer. It's going to be my best opportunity to connect with my customer in ways at multiple levels and in multiple ways. I love when they say that because it is a simplistic approach to a very complex topic. So I always ask, why don't you define for me what best candidate is? For us, the best candidate adds to a team that is diverse and inclusive in its look, feel, and engagement, and because that wins for us in the marketplace. If that's what they mean by best, then they're going to have a diverse pool. If they just mean technically, good luck with connecting with customers in the future. Good luck with your retention rate for young people now who are seeking out a more diverse environment, a company that is clearly, open to ideas and concepts that were foreign to us before. Good luck with your retention efforts after you bring them into a culture that is so rigid and singular that they feel uncomfortable. So I'm just saying I am looking for the best, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
You drop so many nuggets all the time. Question what you believe, challenge what you hear. You said that before, and you also have said we need to get more comfortable with being different and intentional about getting more comfortable. I always say we need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, but I like the way you said it better. So talk to us a little bit more about questioning what we hear or challenging what we hear for the purpose of moving forward.
Yeah, so questioning what we believe is based on my upbringing and my age, and the time period I came of age. I've got a certain soundtrack in my head about what life is and how life is, and race is embedded in it. And since I now know that, I've got to start questioning what I believe, because some of the stuff I believe is just stupid. Some of it is dated. Some of it was never right in the first place. But remember, we learned about race from our friends in our silo that we lived in. We already agreed that's not a good place to learn about race. So that's the question, what you believe. Because when you do that, you open up your mind to say, I might believe something else now. I'm open to hearing new information and to seeing new perspective and the empathy that indicates. And I think that puts us in a different posture. That's why I say that. The question, what you hear is this, going back to where we started, in the country we live in today, we hear some crazy stuff that sounds reasonable. That's the crazy part. It sounds reasonable. Well, why should anybody have any preference in going to college? That sounds reasonable until you dig under the covers. That even with all of that preference, the numbers are still minuscule at best. Oh, by the way, we've been giving preference to people in college based on legacy for generations, but no one questions that preference. So it sounds logical on the surface, but we got to start questioning what we hear. It makes us curious. It makes us learners. It gives us a chance to hold up to and I don't want to get too patriotic, but it gives us a chance to stand up and be the nation we proclaimed we'd be when we started this country. And that's going to demand that we, as one-on-one citizens, question the stuff we hear, because social media, politicians, news cycles are feeding us stuff that, quite honestly, we've just got to ask more questions about.
So, Mel, I could listen to you all day.
I could listen to myself all day, too. So that's pretty cool.
Maybe that's why we connect. I can, too. I love how you address race without judgment or indictment, and with honesty on your own self-reflection and where you stand. And in the book, and I keep bringing it up because, like I said, I want people to get some of the nuggets that really resonated with me, but also maybe inspire them to want to pick it up and learn from it, because it's not just a tool that can help you in the workplace, in the AEC industry. It's really a tool that can help you in life and just think about life situations differently. But you said there's no solution to systematic racism. There's just us. So what do we do next, Mel? What's next?
Yeah. Yeah. What I mean by that statement, Candice, is we've all been waiting for someone to solve this for us. We're all got good intentions. We don't want to live with racism permeating through our systems. We don't want injustice to be in our country. But the truth is, the answer is in us. The answer is in the one-on-ones. And what I'm most proud of about the outcome of this book are the conversations I am having with business leaders around the country. It is the most hopeful thing I've ever seen in my life. Not that we agree politically, not that we even agree philosophically. Heck, half the letters in here, they like, no way, that's crazy. But we connect in what I think it takes to move us forward. And we connect in a way that is authentic about making a difference. So what do I suggest people do? Number one, I think people have to get more comfortable themselves with this topic of race. Whatever you got to read, whatever you got to listen to, whatever you got to reflect on, get more comfortable, because it is our discomfort, lack of willingness to want to be uncomfortable, the fear of being attacked that is holding us back from having a better, more enriched, more enlightening conversation about race. The second thing, though, is I want people to look around at their own sphere of influence and sphere of control and look at the things that they can do in that sphere to close the gap between the races, whether it's relationship gap or if it's a opportunity gap for jobs and business and investment, whether it's a understanding gap. So where can you in your life, your sphere of influence and your sphere of control, make a difference in closing the gap between the races? Because we don't have to agree on everything, but we can agree that we've got that power. The last concept I'll leave with you is this idea of actions of intentionality. Take actions of intentionality to close the gap between races. There is an investor in town who was raising a fund. He decided, after reading my book, didn't know this person then, but I came to know them later, read the book and said, I'm going to do something. So he's raising a fund, and he decided 10% of the investors were going to be African-American. The problem was he didn't know any African-Americans with money. And so he needed some help. But the beautiful thing is, number one, it took him longer to close his fund, not because he needed the money, but because he had to go build new friends, a new network of people. But when he does the next fund, he's going to have new friends. He's going to have new networks. That now we've broken a cycle of no Blacks investing in this fund, which is where he was before, to having, I think he's got 10 African Americans investing in that fund. And those folks will have a relationship with him as they do more funds go down in the future. That's an example of what one individual said, I can change this. People are changing the way they're looking at hiring and pushing their recruiting firms to have more diverse talent. That's a way. But you can make it in small ways of where you're eating and spending your money, where you're getting entertained by, what movies are you watching. There are a lot of ways to get more enlightened about this topic, and I'm just encouraging people to start where they are on their journey. And my book is one way to do that for sure, but then just keep moving it forward, because I think as you become more enlightened, you realize how important this is to your own enrichment, how important this is to what you stand for as a great American. And I think it gives you some energy to help propel you forward.
One thing I like to do at the end of the podcast is just kind of wrap it up on a fun note. So I want to ask, what's your favorite thing to do in your pastime?
I love to write. My wife and I work out religiously, and so there's a bit of a joy from that. But if I really had to break it down, it's sofa next to my wife watching something absolutely stupid on some streaming channel. That would be my favorite thing to do. Maybe a little glass of wine and some cheese.
And that is an amazing thing to do, especially when you have such a busy life like I'm sure you both have. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences in Dear White Friend, for creating the opportunities and equity at your firm, but also helping us to do the same. And also thank you for taking time to talk to our listeners today, Mel. We appreciate it.
Candice, anytime. What you guys are doing there at SSOE is special. Appreciate you leading the way. This podcast is just one example of the many things you're doing and leading the way and making the difference in your sphere of influence.
Thank you for listening to this episode of A Blueprint for Equity. I hope you gained some insights to inspire you wherever you're at in your own DEI journey. To see today's show notes, visit our podcast page at ssoe.com/podcast. While you're there, you can leave a review, subscribe to the show, and suggest future topics and guests. Until next time, remember that constructing a more inclusive AEC community is a journey that we're all on together. If you have any thoughts or questions, feel free to look me up on LinkedIn, and you can learn more about careers at SSOE by visiting ssoe.com/careers.